Turn now to the situation regarding the floods. So many people there still waiting for help in KZN. One of the organizations that is sending help is the South African National Defence Force. From what I understand, they're sending around 10,000 people to KZN to help people there. You can imagine how important the army might be during this time. But our military's had severe problems over the last few years. It's had many budget cuts and hasn't been able to even properly maintain some of its equipment. Guy Martin is the editor at the website Defenceweb. He joins us now. Guy, good afternoon to you and thanks for your time. We've all seen the disaster movies, you know, where the army arrives and suddenly there's order and food and organization at a disaster. When you consider the size of this catastrophe, what do you think is going to happen here when the SAND arrives? What are they able to do?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and thanks for having me. So I wish it were that simple that the SANDF would arrive in KZN and everything would almost miraculously return to normal. But unfortunately, that's not the case. The SANDF is providing what they can, and it's quite a big deployment. I think it's about 10,000 troops. It's 4 helicopters, a fixed-wing aircraft, several dozen water tankers, water purification systems, water points, electricians, plumbers, accommodation, and so on. So it's quite a lot that they're sending to KZN, but it could be a lot more. If you look at their aerial contingent, it's only 4 helicopters, and out of a fleet of about 40 Oryx helicopters, which are the largest in the South African Air Force. Only about 10 are currently available in South Africa. We've got, I think, 5 in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a couple in Mozambique, and the rest are unserviceable. In terms of light helicopters, there's a few BK-117s in KZN, but again, majority of Air Force aircraft are unserviceable. And as of February this year, only a quarter of the Air Force's entire fleet was airworthy. And the situation hasn't really improved. So in terms of what's being provided to KZN, most of it is coming from the Army. And the state of our ground forces is a little bit better than the Air Force and the Navy. The Navy has got their own problems. I'm sure you're aware, the Air Force and the Navy operate very expensive equipment and proving harder and harder to service that because the money just isn't there. As I mentioned, most aircraft in the Air Force are unserviceable, and it's a similar situation with the Navy. Most of their frigates and submarines are not seaworthy.
It's really an incredible situation to find that only a quarter of what the Air Force has can actually fly. Is this all because of budget cuts? Is it as simple as that? And I mean, it does make sense. It costs a lot of money to maintain this stuff, and it also has to be flown regularly.
Yes, so budget cuts are the main reason why so few aircraft are serviceable. The Air Force has barely half of the budget it needs to actually fly and maintain its aircraft. And this wouldn't be a problem if the Air Force didn't have so many jobs to do. So the Air Force, like the rest of the SANDF, is very thinly stretched. There's the United Nations deployment in the DRC, there's the SADC employment in Mozambique and Cabo Delgado. We've got thousands of troops on the borders. We've seen the SANDF respond to the COVID pandemic. And now, obviously, there was also the July riots, and most recently, search and rescue and disaster relief in KZN. So the Air Force is being, like the rest of the Defence Force, is being pulled in many different directions, and it doesn't have the budget to do all the things it's asked to do. So part of the problem is budget. One of the other issues is the situation at Denel. So Denel's been struggling to maintain South African Air Force aircraft because they're running out of cash and they're losing skilled personnel. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused some disruptions as well, and that hasn't helped the situation. But the biggest problem is the defense budget, which is less than 1% of GDP, whereas the international norm is about 2% of GDP.
So sorry guys, always an interesting debate, because if you had to say to people, we really need a military that works, should we spend more money on the military? Many people would say yes. If you had to say, should we spend more money on the military or should we increase social grants? Well, that's where the debate starts to get a little complicated. There's a trade-off. There's another bigger point, and you've alluded to this already. I do think it's worth just exploring a little more. So just in the last 3 years, off the top of my journalistic head, I can remember the South African National Defence Force being deployed to the Western Cape in gang areas there after violence there. I can remember, obviously we all remember, soldiers being deployed to police, if you like, the national disaster regulations at the start of the pandemic. Now we have this. There's Cabo Delgado, as you mentioned, the DRC, as you mentioned. All of this suggests that really the problem is that we're asking the military to do all sorts of things. I mean, we shouldn't really need the military to help in a disaster, but we do. Precisely.
People forget that the SANDF and militaries in general are not just there for conflict. The SANDF is a very, very active peacetime military. Another example of what they've been doing is assisting with the sewage crisis in the Vaal. They've been building bridges in remote areas across the country. There are many things that keep the military busy. And it's all very well to reduce the defense budget, but then the government needs to say, well, if we reduce the defense budget, we're going to reduce the number of jobs that we're going to give the military. And we've seen the opposite. The SANDF is being tasked to do more and more and more, and their budget is essentially shrinking. So it's about 50 billion rand a year, and it's remained relatively static. So in effect, in real terms, the defense budget is actually shrinking. And we're also seeing the closure of the special defense account. A lot of that money went towards sort of big ticket items of the SANDF. So more and more is being asked and less is being given. And it's getting to a rather precarious situation. For instance, in Mozambique, a few months ago, a South African soldier was killed. And part of the shortcoming in in Mozambique is that our soldiers were deployed with very little air cover, and because we don't have the budgets and the aircraft available to send to Mozambique, and this leaves our troops vulnerable and exposed. And I think it's going to be a matter of time before we see more soldiers dying because they don't have the support that they need.
Sure. Guy Martin, thank you. Editor at Defenceweb. I really appreciate the time.